When the U.S. jumped into World War I, back in April 1917, it was this rising global power, with a surprisingly tiny military. It was completely, and I mean completely, unprepared for the kind of industrial warfare that was tearing Europe apart. So how did they do it? How does a nation transform itself, its army, and its whole society to fight on the world stage? Well, let's get into it.
Take a look at this number, 309,000. That's it. That was the combined size of the U.S. Army and the National Guard in 1917. Now, to give you some perspective, the French Army at the time had millions of soldiers. This tiny American force was supposed to go up against the might of the German Empire. It's just staggering to think about.
And that really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? How on earth do you go from a military that's smaller than many European nations to a force that can actually tip the balance on the Western Front? The answer, it turns out, would change America forever.
So the first, most massive task was just forging that new army. It literally had to be built from the ground up, and they had to do it fast.
You know, the initial response was huge. Congress threw a jaw-dropping $3 billion at the problem, and patriotism was through the roof. 2 million Americans actually volunteered to go fight. But here's the thing. In a war of this unbelievable scale, even that incredible number of volunteers just wasn't going to cut it. To really build the army they needed, the government had to do something much, much bigger. So on May 18, 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. This wasn't just asking for volunteers anymore. This was a temporary draft. It was a mandate. If you were a man between 21 and 45, you had to register. This act became the engine that would build the modern American military machine.
Now, what's really telling here is the time lag. Look at this. War is declared in April of 1917, right? But it takes until the summer for the first American troops to even set foot in Europe. And it's not until the spring of 1918, a full year later, that U.S. forces really start to see significant combat. That timeline just shows you the massive, massive undertaking it was to train and equip this brand new army.
But, this new army wasn't some single, unified force. Not at all. It reflected all the deep divisions in American society at the time. So now let's talk about the diverse groups who answered the call to serve and the incredible paradoxes they faced, fighting for freedom overseas while often being denied it right here at home.
This chart gives us a quick snapshot of that diversity. You've got over 20,000 Black Americans who served. You've got 12,000 Native Americans, and remember, many of them weren't even considered U.S. citizens yet. They also joined the fight. But get this, 18% of the entire army, that's nearly 1 in 5 soldiers, were immigrants. These groups contributed so much, but their experiences were totally different.
And this right here shows the stark reality for Black soldiers. Under American command, they were put in segregated units. They were often stuck in support roles, building roads, burying the dead. They were completely barred from joining the Marines. But when some of those units, like the legendary Harlem Hellfighters, were assigned to fight under French command, everything changed. Suddenly, they were treated as combat equals, and they earned medals for incredible heroism. It was a night and day difference.
For another group, military service opened a door that had been slammed shut. For Asian Americans who fought in the war, many of whom were legally barred from becoming citizens, their service created a direct path. Serving the country made them eligible to become U.S. citizens, a right that had been denied to so many of them before the war.
Okay, so while this new army was being built and sent to Europe, an equally massive transformation was happening right here at home. The war effort didn't just need an army of soldiers, it needed a whole new army of workers.
And this was the next huge problem. I mean, think about it. With millions of men now in the military, who was left to work in the factories? Who was going to run the railroads or harvest the food needed to supply the entire war effort?
Well, the answer completely changed the face of the American workforce. Women and minorities stepped into these critical jobs on a scale that nobody had ever seen before. They moved into factories, military support roles, farms, fundamentally changing the country's economic landscape. And the kinds of jobs women took on, it was incredible. More than 11,000 joined the Navy to free up men for sea duty, working as clerks and radio operators. They served overseas as ambulance drivers and telephone operators for the Army. And back home, they were building military equipment in factories and even driving tractors on farms. They were absolutely essential.
That labor shortage also created this powerful economic pull for minorities. For the first time, Black Americans were getting access to higher quality, better paying industrial jobs in factories and on the railroads, opportunities that had been almost completely closed off to them before the war.
And you have to understand, all of these shifts, military, social, economic, they weren't just temporary fixes for the war. They set in motion an era of deep, lasting change in American society.
And maybe the single most significant of these changes was the beginning of what we now call the Great Migration. Those new factory jobs up north created this powerful reason for Black Americans to leave the rural South in huge numbers. The war really was the catalyst for this massive demographic shift.
And it's so important to get this. This was way more than just a move on a map. This was a monumental leap. It was people leaving lives that were often defined by sharecropping and domestic service, all for the hope of a new future in America's industrial cities. This migration would go on to reshape the cultural, political, and demographic map of the U.S. for generations to come.
So in the end, the mobilization for World War I no doubt forged a more powerful America, a nation that could project its strength across the entire globe. But as we've seen, the experience was complex. It opened up new opportunities for some, while at the same time reinforcing old barriers for others. Which really leaves us with this big question. The war created a more powerful America, but did it create a more equal one?